Excellent. Welcome everyone today. Welcome to this talk today. I want to thank you guys for being here. As Dr. Perez mentioned, my name is Dr. Jonathan Banks, and I am an associate professor here in the Department of Psychology and Neuroscience in the College of Psychology. I'm also the director for our Master's in Experimental Psychology program here in our department. So I want to talk to you today about mindfulness, right? And exactly what mindfulness is and why we care about it. Why hopefully you'll care more about it after this talk than you might now. But in order to explain kind of why you want to care about it, I'm going to talk to you a little bit first about stress. Right? And the reason I care about mindfulness meditation is that I'm a cognitive psychologist. I'm not a clinical psychologist. I focus on attentional control and working memory, our ability to focus our attention when we want to focus it, and then kind of what happens when we're unable to focus that attention. What happens when we lose that attentional control and our mind drifts off? So as part of this, I really started in grad school looking at how stress impairs cognitive functioning, right? And when we think about what's going on right now, obviously, I'm assuming there's maybe at least a little bit of stress that everyone's experiencing. And so when we think about that, and that approach, right, the fact that stress impairs some cognitive functioning, then maybe we'll see a little bit about why mindfulness might be helpful. Again, as a cognitive psychologist, I care about what's going on and what's impacting our ability to focus our attention, what's causing us to maybe lose our focus. So before we go too much further, I want to make sure that we're all operating under the same operational definition for what mindfulness is, right? As a good scientist, I want to make sure that we define the process we're studying. So I know you've heard a lot about mindfulness. You've heard a lot about meditation. It's everywhere in the media. And so it's kind of hard to not see it. But what's important is that there are a lot of different definitions of meditation and different operational definitions. What we're going to work from, right, what I work from in terms of my research, really kind of started a little bit with Jon Kabat-Zinn and his mindfulness-based stress reduction program, right? Already we're talking about stress. So how can we reduce stress? And Kabat-Zinn has a wonderful 8-week course to teach people aspects of mindfulness, and specifically for the research that I'm going to talk to you about today, for most of it, and what I base my work in, I'm really operating from this definition by Davidson and Goleman in 1977 that said the goal is to improve awareness through increases in focused attention and through open monitoring of sensations without reactivity to the sensations or the thoughts. Now, already there are kind of two pieces to this, right? The first piece is this focused attention piece. So when we think about a focused attention, what we're really talking about is our ability to sustain selective attention on a specific object, right? So how well can we sustain our attention on that one object? Maybe that object is a breath, or a feeling in our body, or maybe that object is kind of external. We might be thinking about something we're looking at, right? So we're sustaining attention. This is our ability to focus our attention on one thing. The other piece is this open monitoring part, right? So open monitoring involves remaining attentive, moment by moment, to anything that occurs, right? To anything that occurs without focusing on a specific object. The analogy I've heard and I really like is think about sitting in your car at a train crossing and you're watching all those trains cross or watching all the trains go by, but you're not really letting anyone capture your attention or hijack your attention. The goal here for open monitoring is to remain attentive to your thoughts, but not let anyone necessarily hijack your attention and take over and take control. So again, we've got these two pieces: focused attention, our ability to focus our attention on a specific object, as well as the open monitoring, remaining attentive to what's happening without focusing on any one object. And ultimately, what we're doing in all of this is we're training attention, right? We're trying to strengthen that attentional muscle, if you will. And through strengthening this attentional muscle, maybe we have some of the benefits that we're going to talk about. But let's think about what attention is, right? If I'm asking for your attention, I'm asking you to focus that attention. And this spotlight actually works really well as an analogy. So the spotlight is, I'm going to focus on a subset of all of the available information that might be in my perception or I might be thinking about. I'm focusing my attention on this one thing. And that's really helpful. It helps us get our work done or pay attention to a conversation if your spouse or your child is talking to you, right? It's helpful to be able to focus that attention. But sometimes there are things in our environment that really do need to capture our attention, right? Sometimes there are things that we need to notice, right? And we have to notice something that's happening. Well, our attentional system is built so that some sorts of stimuli will capture our attention, even when we're trying to focus. Now, our attentional system's really kind of evolved not to deal with the things we deal with now, but rather for these types of things to capture our attention, right? Lions, tigers, bears, those things should capture our attention because those are threats. They're threats that are likely to kill us if we don't notice them and run or look large or whatever we need to do to avoid those specific predators. The problem is the types of things that we deal with now are probably not those types of things. I'm betting, and I may be wrong, right? I'm betting that most of us on this Zoom webinar have probably not had to run from lions and tigers and bears. We'll throw in alligators for South Florida too, right? Most of the time, you're probably not having to run from those types of stressors, those types of threats. But negatively valent stimuli still does capture our attention. Maybe it's the lions and tigers and bears, or maybe it's things in your everyday life, right? It's deadlines for work. Your boss is calling. Something's due. You have a long to-do list. You're worried maybe about financial troubles. You're worried about right now with COVID, right? You're worried about being ill or your loved ones being ill or family members dying, things of that nature. And this isn't just adults, right? We see this in children as well, stressed because of schoolwork and all of those other social aspects, right? Kids are not immune to these stressors. Adults aren't immune to these stressors, but these stressors, these thoughts pop into our head and cause problems. These types of stimuli are likely to capture our attention. Well, you might say, so what, right? So that happens, right? My phone's going off all the time telling me I have to be someplace or I have to go to a call or some deadline is approaching. So what, right? Why would it be a problem that we have all this stress? Well, for me, again, as a cognitive psychologist, I care about this because psychological stress impairs a host of cognitive functions. We see impairments in working memory capacity, our ability to maintain and manipulate information, our ability to control attention. So Slowinski and colleagues have shown that on days where we experience more stressors, our working memory performance is lower. On days we have fewer stressors, our working memory performance is higher. Other work showing that the amount of overall life stress results in poorer working memory. We see impairments in decision-making, impairments in problem solving. And when we have more psychological stress, we also experience more everyday cognitive failures. Now, I like talking about these because we all experience them. There are things like walking into a room and forgetting why you went there, or forgetting where you left your keys or where you parked your car, right? Those sort of everyday experiences. And maybe you've noticed this, right? Maybe you've noticed during the last, 2 months, where we've been kind of at home and quarantining and doing all of those things, you might have noticed an increase in these. I know I have. I've noticed an increase in these just basic everyday cognitive failures. Okay, so we know that stress impairs a lot of different cognitive failures. When I started this work, I wanted to know why, right? Why does stress impair specifically working memory and sustained attention? Well, one possible explanation that we've identified is mind wandering, right? And we've all experienced mind wandering, right? We'll define these as any task unrelated thoughts or TUTs. So this is any sort of thought you have while you're working on some task that is off task. Now, this is a really common occurrence. It occurs during 30 to 50% of our everyday life. So 30 to 50% of our daily waking hours, we experience mind wandering. So this is hardly something that's unusual, right? Maybe you're sitting at work or working at home, and realistically, you're actually thinking about being Iron Man and how great that would be. Or maybe you're thinking about actually being able to go and sit on the beach. Or kids in classrooms, right? Sitting there trying to pay attention to what's going on, and they've drifted off. Now, the problem when we experience these off-task thoughts is that sometimes we might try to suppress them, right? We might say, no, I don't want to think about being Iron Man. I have to work. The problem with that is that when we try to suppress those thoughts, well, think about it. When you try to not think about something, what happens? We experience more of those thoughts, right? When you try to not think about it, we get this ironic rebound effect that Wegner identified, saying that when we try to not think about something, we can maybe for a little while, but then that thought pops into our head at a greater rate. So it rebounds. Well, you might say, okay, so what? What's the harm in mind wandering? Well, the harm in mind wandering is that it's associated with performance impairments on a lot of different things. So, and not just lab tasks. So we see performance impairments in driving performance. Obviously, that's problematic. We want to, hopefully, as we're driving down the interstate, driving down the road, we should be focused on the road. We shouldn't be thinking about something else, because otherwise we could end up having car accidents and all sorts of negative consequences. We see performance impairments when people mind wander on sustained attention tasks, on working memory tasks, even reading comprehension. And I know we've probably all experienced this, that you're reading a page and you get to the end of the page and you realize you have no idea what was on that page. And so now we have to go back and reread it. So mind wandering is problematic. It's harmful in the classroom. A series of studies by Whammies and colleagues showed that when individuals report mind wandering during a lecture, their performance on a quiz covering that material was poorer. So mind wandering is not good for ongoing tasks. I think we can all kind of agree on that. If you're mind wandering, whatever you're doing currently may be impaired. Maybe you've had an experience where you're talking to someone and having a conversation with a friend, or you're supposed to be listening to your spouse or your child, and your mind has drifted off. You haven't maybe been aware that it's drifted off, but then you realize you have no idea what that person has been saying. And that has negative consequences too. Now, some recent work from my lab has suggested that not all mind wandering seems to be as problematic for performance. What we've shown is that negatively valenced mind wandering, these negatively valenced TUTs, are more strongly predictive of poor task performance than positive off-task thoughts. So think about that for a second. If you're thinking about something negative, some stressor that's occurred, something harmful, some threat in your life, some worry you have, that appears to be a stronger predictor of poor performance. If, on the other hand, you're thinking about something happy, right? So maybe I'm thinking about getting to go to Disney again, or getting to see my family. All of a sudden, that does not appear to be as harmful to ongoing performance. And maybe that's why the link with stress matters. When we're stressed, when we have off-task thoughts, I'm going to speculate that we're probably not having a lot of off-task thoughts about happy things. We're probably having a lot of off-task thoughts about those personal concerns and those worries. Okay, so now that you understand what stress does, right? What stress does and how that may operate, let's think a little bit about how that might apply with mindfulness. So again, our definition, we're improving awareness through increases in focused attention and through open monitoring of sensations without reactivity to those sensations. So the first question is, well, when does mindfulness help? Does it help? And when does it help? And again, to be clear, when I'm thinking about the impact of mindfulness, I'm really thinking about the impact of mindfulness on cognitive functioning, on working memory, on our ability to control our attention. So when does it help? And then maybe we can start to figure out why, like, how does it help? What are the mechanisms that allow it to be beneficial? So I'm going to talk about a couple studies that have shown some beneficial effects here. So the first study done in college students by Merzik and colleagues had college students complete a 2-week mindfulness training course, and the other half of the participants completed a nutrition training course. And they took pre and post measures of verbal GRE, pre and post measures of working memory capacity, and then pre and post measures of mind wandering. And what they find is that for the mindfulness condition, we see an increase. See if I can use my laser pointer to show you an increase here in our verbal GRE scores. That's really helpful for college students that are trying to take the GRE to get into grad school. We also see an increase here in working memory capacity, right? And that's our ability to control our attention, to maintain and manipulate information. So we see these beneficial effects after a relatively brief 2-week training. We also see decreases in 2 types of mind wandering. We see decreases here in probe-caught mind wandering and self-reported mind wandering. So in mind wandering that the researchers stopped them during a task and said, hey, what are you thinking about? It's a probe-caught. And self-reported, as someone's doing a task, they realize they're off task and they say, hey, sorry, I was off task. I'm gonna get back to the task. Now, that's nice in college students. And yes, college students are stressed, right? That is definitely the case. But even before all of this pandemic occurred, college students are definitely stressed. But a really cool study by Amishi Jha and colleagues looking at a much higher stress population, right? So here we're looking at a group of pre-deployment U.S. Marine reservists. That pre-deployment period can absolutely be very stressful. And this was during an 8-week mindfulness training. So a much longer mindfulness training. In this training, they met with a trainer who had in-person classes, and then they were given, as most trainings do, given homework to kind of go do this at home, practice this over the next week, and then we'll come back and talk about it. Right, so they completed this mindful-based mind fitness training program. Now, remember, during a stressful period, we should expect to see working memory performance go down, right? We should expect to see decreases in working memory because working memory task performance, at least, because of the stressor. So anything that is not a decrease would be good. What they found was actually even better than good, right? So what they found was that in that high practice group, so they looked at individuals who did the practice, right? They did the training session, but then they went home and they practiced on their own more. In that group, we see an increase in working memory performance, an increase in O-span scores. The control group, again, stress group, but they're not getting any sort of intervention. We see a decrease in working memory, which is exactly what they would expect. And Jha found a decrease in performance for those that practice just a little bit, right? The low practice group. And what you see here in their figure B is that as practice time goes up, time to O-span score goes up as well. Remember, we're thinking about this like training a muscle, right? We're training attention. Think about what would happen if you're not in shape and you decide to go run a half marathon, right? Or maybe you do a little bit of running and then all of a sudden you just jump up to something big, right? If you did that, you're likely to maybe injure yourself, right? You're going to tear something. And so maybe that's what's happening in this low performance group. They're trying a little bit, and now we're seeing some impairments. Those that try enough, those that practice at a higher level, now all of a sudden improve. Improvements in working memory performance during the stressful period is pretty impressive. Again, this is a very high stress group with these pre-deployment Marine reservists. Jha's group replicated some of these similar results, but in football players, in college football players, again, during a high stress preseason training, during this time, all of a sudden, those that practiced the training, that practiced the mindfulness training, showed increases, right? The more practice time they had, the greater change they had in sustained attention. So this does really much feel like the dose matters, right? How much you do it matters. They actually just published a study last month, I believe, looking at this type of an effect in firefighters, and they found a similar finding. When people practice more, they found benefits. So the greater the practice time, the greater the increase in sustained attention. And so that's really great, right? If we can increase sustained attention in the face of stress, that's wonderful. So I saw some of this work and I thought, well, what could I do in my lab? How much of a dose of this do the participants need? And maybe it's not just what's happening in the session with the trainer, but maybe it also matters in terms of what's happening at home, Are they doing this at home? So I was interested in replicating some of these effects, and we conducted a study looking at a brief mindfulness training on working memory, mind wandering, and importantly, protection from a stressor. So a couple questions that I had. One, could the intervention be delivered at home? Could I give my participants a recording of these mindfulness training, the mindfulness training in the audio recording, and ask them to do it at home? Ask them to do it over the week, 4 to 5 times. And would I get an increase in working memory, right? Would we see an increase in working memory, task performance as a result? And maybe more importantly, would that mindfulness group be protected against a stressor? So far, these populations that we're looking at are high stress populations, military cohorts, football players, firefighters, college students have stress too. So my participants completed either a 1 week at home mindfulness training or a relaxation training. We tried to use this to get a kind of a placebo control here. So what did we find? Well, from pre-training to post-training, everyone got a little bit better. Well, maybe that's not all that surprising. When you do a task a couple times, you're going to get a little bit better at it. That's just a practice effect. Okay, so first question, did it alter working memory by increasing working memory pre to post training over that week? The answer is no. Right? Mindfulness didn't do anything more than the relaxation training did. But we want to know what happened in the face of a stressor. So after they completed, during that second session, after they completed the post training, we then stressed them out. So we had individuals write about a negative life event that had happened to them. Right? And we know that this is stressful in the short term, but in the long term, it's not. They wrote about something stressful to them. And we see in the relaxation group exactly what we would expect to happen in the face of a stressor. We see performance decrease from post-training to post-stressor, just like we would expect in any other population we look at. But what we were really excited to see was that the mindfulness meditation training condition did not show these same impairments. They appeared to be protected. In the face of a stressor, those folks appeared to be protected against the stress manipulation. So that's great. Maybe mindfulness, even a 1 week training, at least for a short term, could be protective. Well, our next thought was, if their working memory hasn't decreased, maybe they're not mind wandering more after the stress manipulation than before. Think about what would happen if you write about some negative life event and then I say, okay, now go do this relatively boring task. It's semi-engaging, but maybe not all that exciting. During that task, you might be thinking still about that stressor, the thing you wrote about. So we looked at their mindfulness, their mind wandering as a result. And what we actually see from post-training to post-stressor is that everyone goes up a little bit. The effect was trended towards significant. It wasn't significant, but everyone increased a little bit. The critical piece here is that the relaxation training and the mindfulness training groups did not differ in terms of mind wandering, which means that our at least brief manipulation didn't do anything to alter mind wandering, yet it still protected working memory from that stress manipulation. So we started thinking about why that might be the case, why it might be the case that it's protective in terms of working memory performance, but it didn't alter mind wandering. And one thing that really spurred this along was that our discovery of the fact that these negative off-task thoughts appear to be more harmful than positive or neutral off-task thoughts. So in collaboration with Amishi Jha and of course my grad students and undergrads, we wanted to replicate this study, but look at a brief 15-minute mindfulness induction, something very quick, very brief in the lab, to see if that is altering the rate of and the impact of negatively valenced mind wandering, these negative TUTs, on sustained attention performance. And again, a sustained attention task, this one was very boring. It lasted about 25 minutes. Participants had to press a space bar every time they saw a number appear on the screen, except for a critical number 3, and that number appeared infrequently. So imagine doing that for about 20 to 25 minutes. Your mind is probably going to drift off. So we had 89 undergrads from Nova Southeastern. 31 completed a mindfulness induction. They simply listened to a brief mindfulness recording. 27 did a relaxation induction, and then we had a waitlist control, participants that kind of just sat there and waited during that time period. They completed working memory tasks, the recordings here. We then again used a similar stress manipulation. We induced that stress, and then we had them do a sustained attention task with thought probes so we could measure their mind wandering. And what did we find? So the mindfulness induction, right, didn't do anything to alter sustained attention performance. Well, maybe with just a 15-minute recording, it's not going to. But importantly, we did see a difference between the groups on the percentage of negative off-task thoughts. Specifically, this mindfulness training condition, the group in green, shows a lower rate of mind wandering than the control condition. What would happen normally if we stress people out? So that it appears maybe that it is protective in that it reduces the number of negative off-task thoughts. And remember I said those negative off-task thoughts, those are the ones that hurt performance. So negative thoughts were predictive of poor performance in the relaxation condition and in the control condition, but not in the mindfulness condition. So not only did we reduce the frequency, but we also reduced the impact of those thoughts on SART performance. So it appears that mindfulness, at least with this study, was helpful in altering what was happening in the content of mind wandering. Now, related to this, some other work by Pace and colleagues looking at a slightly different type of meditation, not a mindfulness meditation, but compassion meditation. So compassion and loving kindness meditation all still have some attention training, that focused attention kind of at their core, but with compassion and loving kindness meditation, there's also a larger influence on kind of being compassionate to yourself, understanding when you fail, it's okay, being compassionate towards others as well. So Pace and colleagues did a 6-week compassion meditation training for half their participants. The other half did a health discussion training. And then at the end, they used a stress manipulation for all of the participants at the end of the 6-week period. And what they find was that the reduced stress response in the compassion meditation training condition was related to the amount of time spent practicing. I think this is kind of a theme coming back, right? The more you do it, the more beneficial it might be for you. So specifically, greater practice time was related to lower IL-6 levels following the stressor, as well as lower ratings of psychological distress. So not only are they rating themselves as having less distress, now we've got lower levels of IL-6, an immune marker here, in response to a stressor. So that's kind of helpful. Fredrickson and colleagues used a 7-week loving kindness meditation compared to a waitlist control, and they showed something similar. They found increases in self-reported positive emotions, increases in life satisfaction, and decreases in depressive symptoms. And I think right now, given all the stress we're under, if we could increase our positive emotions, decrease depressive symptoms, that would actually be really, really helpful. Okay, and one last study I want to talk about. It's not out yet, but it's one that's in preparation with two of my former grad students and my collaborator, Boals, my Ph.D. advisor. We were interested in whether there might be some effect of just dispositional mindfulness. Maybe some people are just more likely to be mindful even before they have any training. And if that's the case, maybe some of the effects that we get from the training would also be consistent with what we get with the dispositional levels of mindfulness. So we were interested in the relationship between dispositional mindfulness, trait mindfulness, if you will, and self-reported levels of stress, self-reported levels of mind wandering, and self-reported levels of cognitive functioning. So we had 346 undergrads from NSU complete 3 measures of each of those constructs. So stress/anxiety, mind wandering, cognitive functioning, and mindfulness. And the goal here was to do what we call a structural equation modeling, so we can actually talk about something like stress or cognitive functioning rather than just the measure that we collected. And so I like a picture to hopefully share these results in a clear fashion. So here's what we found. We found that mindfulness was predictive of lower levels of stress and anxiety, hence the negative sign. Mindfulness was predictive of higher levels of cognitive functioning. And mindfulness was also predictive, of lower levels of mind wandering. And consistent with some of the other work I've already talked about, stress was predictive of higher mind wandering, and that was predictive of lower cognitive functioning. So the idea here is that mindfulness might play a key role in impacting cognitive functioning, really maybe through three paths. One is the direct path, that it may enhance cognitive functioning, or that people with higher dispositional level of mindfulness also have higher levels of cognitive functioning. But also that mindfulness, higher levels of mindfulness, are predictive of lower levels of stress and lower levels of mind wandering. And as a result, they're predictive of better cognitive functioning. So stay tuned for that result to come out. We're actually in the middle of collecting 2 additional studies right now, and hopefully we'll have this out at some point in the next few months. Okay, so I asked maybe at the beginning, how does mindfulness help? It appears that mindfulness does alter cognitive functioning. Mindfulness training appears to be beneficial for cognitive functioning, but again, only when you use that muscle, right? Only when you use it, when you try to practice, then it's beneficial. It appears it may alter the impact of affective interference, right? It definitely appears that it's doing something with these negative off-task thoughts, maybe even negatively valence exogenous stimuli we see in the real world. So I want to thank you all for your attention, and thank you for being mindful and holding questions until the end. And I want to finish kind of my part of this before I answer questions that you might have with a quote from my favorite Jedi philosopher, Obi-Wan Kenobi, saying, "Be mindful of your thoughts, Anakin, they betray you." Be mindful of those thoughts. Don't let them hijack your attention. Thank you very much. And please let me know if you have any questions. Any questions about mindfulness, about stress and attention?
So the first question we got is, how do we practice mindfulness? What are strategies in doing so?
Great question. So really probably the strongest thing to do is find one of the mindfulness-based programs. And they are usually face-to-face. Obviously, that's a little bit of a problem now, but there are programs moving online where you walk through a full MBSR style training, if you will, kind of training focused attention, training open awareness, to reduce that stress. So I think finding one of those programs can be very beneficial to get that core training. Now, in terms of practice and how much you need to practice, I think that it looks like somewhere around 12 to 15 minutes a day. So it's not something you need to spend an hour or 3 hours a day doing. You can do it at very shorter time periods.
Okay, another one that asked is, do you recommend a certain app or program in particular? And then another one asked about the app Headspace.
There are lots of apps out there. I'm not going to necessarily say that I'd recommend one over the other. I think getting started and learning a little bit about mindfulness is good. I think the longer trainings may be a little bit better. I know that Headspace and others have a lot of different recordings. And I think it is important to make sure that you're getting the core training in mindfulness for the best effects.
Okay, another one asked, how can we teach this to our children?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of ways to teach this to your kids. In fact, there's a group in Miami I'm blanking on the name at the moment. I want to say it's Miami Kids Mindfulness or something to that effect, that actually really does this work. And I think with kids, I know my son likes to listen to a lot of different meditation recordings that I have and that he uses to reduce stress. And I think, oh yeah, sorry, someone mentioned Mindful Kids Miami. Thank you, Celeste, for that. So there are programs out there for kids that can be helpful.
Does this training help improve the cognitive functioning and working memory in all types of population?
So most of the studies we've looked at so far, and I talked about a lot in high stress populations. And so it looks like it may be really beneficial in those high stress groups, but that it could be helpful in other populations as well. Again, my work as a cognitive psychologist is not necessarily on the clinical side. So I don't want to make any recommendations in terms of what could be happening in different clinical populations. But in otherwise healthy adults, that can be helpful. But again, it seems to be that it's helpful in that it protects against stress. So it may not be that it's necessarily bumping working memory up higher. It could be that it's just helping us get back to kind of our maximum capacity.
Can you please speak to the help that mindfulness may bring to individuals with ADHD?
Sure. So again, I'm not a clinical psychologist, and obviously, individuals with ADHD there are attention deficit problems, and so if we can do anything to focus our attention and strengthen our attention, I think that could be helpful. I'm not aware of any studies necessarily doing training in this population, right, dealing with ADHD, and so I don't want to say that yes, it's going to be beneficial and that be a problem, because I think we need to be really clear about the science before you start saying that yes, it's going to be helpful for this group or yes, it'll be helpful for others. We see in the face of stress, it's really helpful for kind of normal, healthy adults and kids.
What can a person do to control their thoughts?
Well, I think part of what we talked about today with mindfulness is that mindfulness may be very beneficial in terms of helping individuals monitor their thoughts, that open monitoring practice, so that they're able to monitor what's going on, but not necessarily let any one thought kind of hijack their attention, as well as the focused attention part where they're able to better focus on one thing that they want to focus on.
Can maladaptive daydreaming and a lack of mindfulness be a sign of underlying mental illness?
That I don't know, and that's I wouldn't say daydreaming is a sign of any underlying mental health concern. If anything, I hope that the numbers we started off with at the beginning, showing that 30 to 50% of individuals, or sorry, 30 to 50% of our day we spend mind wandering, hopefully is just kind of an indication that we do mind wander a lot. And so, and we know that some individuals mind wander more than others. Some really great work coming out of Mike Kane's lab and others has shown that individuals who are higher in working memory tend to mind wander less. They're better able to focus their attention. And we know that there are individual differences in working memory, which probably leads to some of the individual differences in mind wandering, at least at points when we're trying to control our attention, when we're putting in that effort to control our attention, as opposed to maybe if you're just sitting on the couch watching TV and letting your mind wander off. So I wouldn't say that mind wandering is at all necessarily a sign of any underlying condition.
So we got a lot of questions about resources like books and reading materials that you recommend to learn more about mindfulness.
So I don't have any books necessarily per se that I would recommend one over the other. I think there's a lot of great scientific literature out there. I think there are a lot of wonderful groups out there that put on different mindfulness training. So maybe the first place to start is to look at John Kabat-Zinn's website, where he's really doing the mindfulness based stress reduction, the MBSR work. And I think that might be a good starting point. The Mindfulness Kids Miami is another one with lots of resources there.
What's the difference between mindfulness and meditation?
Sure. So I would say meditation really is a larger category. And so what I look in my lab and a lot of others is really looking at mindfulness meditation. So that's that focused attention, open monitoring. We see other types of meditation, like I talked about a little bit with the compassion meditation and loving kindness meditation. In terms of the cognitive effects that I care about, given my work, I really do care about the mindfulness components, because those are the ones that seem to be potentially strongest in terms of benefiting cognitive functioning. Although you saw that at least the two studies I talked about with loving kindness meditation and compassion meditation are helpful in the face of stress. They are helpful in terms of higher positive mind wandering and things of that nature. Higher positive moods and lower depression episodes or depression symptomatology.
What do you say about those who say that they can't focus long enough or feel like they are doing it wrong?
I think, at least in talking to some of the mindfulness trainers that I have had a privilege to talk to, that I think a lot of them would suggest that you're not really doing it wrong. And focusing our attention is not easy. Focusing our attention is harder for some than for others. And so I think if you're putting in that effort, you're putting in that time, then you're going to get some benefit, at least following these MBSR style or mindfulness style trainings that we've been discussing. That our ability to focus our attention is really hard. And especially now, I don't know if anyone else has experienced this, but given everything going on in terms of stress with the world right now, I think concentrating now at home may be even harder. I know working from home, if you're sharing your home with you and your spouse and your kids, and we're all trying to do work at the same time, there's a lot of distraction going on in our environment. And that really makes focusing our attention much, much harder. Actually, I see one question that just popped up that asked about cancer treatments and mindfulness. There is a little bit of work looking at other health impacts of mindfulness. And what I'll say is that it doesn't appear that it does appear that it's maybe reducing stress. There was a study looking at individuals who had been diagnosed with breast cancer. And so it reduced some of the stress that might be associated with receiving that diagnosis and treatment, the psychological component of that.
Does the time of day that mindfulness is practiced matter? And does it matter if it's the same time every day?
I would say no. I don't know any literature that suggests that there's a best time of day. I think the time of day that works for you may be the best time of day. But again, I don't know of any data that's suggesting that one time of day is better than the others.
Should stress management be done before successfully being able to practice mindfulness?
I'm assuming that question has to do with kind of stress management strategies. So I think one part about the mindfulness training is that it does involve how it is helpful in terms of dealing with that stress. So I don't know that I'd say that you have to do any sort of pre-training, if you will, right? I don't think you have to do something like a stress management course before you can do mindfulness. I don't think that would be the case.
Are there studies that connect mindfulness to reductions in procrastination?
Reductions in procrastination. I I am not aware of any, although I'll say that this literature base has kind of exploded in the last couple of years. And so if you look at the number of studies looking at mindfulness in the last couple of years, it's grown substantially. I don't know if there's anything necessarily looking at procrastination, but that's just because that really has not been my area that I've been focused on. So none that I'm aware of.
Are there any cross-cultural research done on this topic?
In terms of comparing maybe how mindfulness could be more beneficial in some than others, I'm assuming is maybe the question. I know there's a lot of work going on in mindfulness all across the world. And so it's not just something happening in the US or in other places. I'm seeing articles from a lot of different areas. And in terms of the effects, I haven't seen anyone necessarily comparing an effect, say in the US versus some other country. But I've got no reason to believe that what's going on would be culturally specific. After all, at least in terms of the mindfulness component, we're training attention. And so as a result, when we're training attention, that attentional control mechanism is not culturally dependent. That attentional control mechanism is going to be similar across cultures, because ultimately, hopefully what we're looking at is the same basic cognitive function for humans.
Is there any correlation between age and mindfulness practice? And then a couple other people asked if there was any suggested age groups to when to start mindfulness practice.
So I don't know that I'd say that it's better for any one age group than others. At least in terms of the work that I'm looking at in terms of what's happening for cognitive functioning, I think we have individuals across the lifespan that are stressed. And so as a result, we should see a benefit from mindfulness training. How early is too early to start? I don't know that I've seen any data really looking at kind of what time or what age would be helpful. I know of a lot of teachers that do mindfulness practices with students, really to kind of keep them, to help them focus their attention, right? To reduce stress, reduce distraction. And so I don't know that I'd want to say kind of what age you should start. But I think even younger children can enjoy or can benefit maybe from thinking about mindfulness and from listening to the recordings and trying to implement some of those tactics.
So a participant said that their mind wanders a lot during lecture and they have a hard time focusing. So what's your advice on how they should practice to help concentrate better and lock my focus on the lecture?
Yeah, and you know what? I see that sometimes in my classes. I'm hoping that you guys haven't mind wandered too much. I try to be engaging both in this and then obviously in-person classes. I miss my in-person classes. I miss seeing my students. But I think it's maybe natural for your mind to wander off at points. And as a result, I think something like mindfulness does help strengthen that attentional control so that hopefully you're better able to focus your attention when that happens. Another area it's not related to mindfulness per se, but work done by my Ph.D. advisor and a whole lot of others looking at something called expressive writing. When people experience some sort of stressor that's happened to them, when they write about it, again, a couple of times, I'm not talking about writing about it every day for a month, I'm talking a handful of 3-4 sessions where they can write about it. They experience fewer intrusive thoughts and other studies shown increases in GPA. And my bet is that's because they're now in class and they're able to focus in class rather than thinking about that off-task thought or that stressor that's happened to them. And so I think mindfulness may play a similar role in that it strengthens your attentional control so you can focus attention better during that task. And some folks, some researchers speculate that one reason we mind wander is to give ourselves kind of that short mental break. So we can have that short mental break and then come right back to the task as if, so that we're more focused when we come back. But we know that some folks are better at doing that than others. Individuals high in working memory capacity are simply better able to focus their attention.
Does mindfulness improve long-term memory or short-term memory?
So I don't know of any studies necessarily looking at improving long-term memory, but when we think about short-term memory has kind of been replaced by this model of working memory. That working memory can help us control our attention, depending on the model you're working from. Maybe it's helping to maintain and manipulate information, kind of that short-term store of information. So absolutely helping short-term. Long-term, there was an article that came out a couple years ago suggesting that following a mindfulness training, people were more likely to experience false memories on a false memory task in the lab. And so there's some debate about maybe what could happen as a result. But in terms of enhancing short-term or working memory, absolutely.
Is there any research on mindfulness with inmates?
I'm not aware of any research on mindfulness with inmates. But again, you're dealing with a high stress population. So at any point where you're dealing with individuals experiencing stress, whether it's stress because of your job, your career, firefighters, and the military cohorts, or you're dealing with stress because of some other situation you're in, whether you're quarantined at home, or whether you're an inmate, right? Maybe that could be beneficial.
Has mindfulness been found to be particularly helpful when recovering from PTSD?
I'm not aware of any work looking specifically at PTSD. We know that there are things that are very effective in terms of dealing with PTSD, exposure therapy and things of that nature that are actually quite effective for PTSD. In terms of what's happening with if mindfulness could help, I would want to see that literature before I comment. I think it's very easy to say, hey, here's something that might help. Let's look at it in this population or this population. But before that data is really there, I think it's important to make sure that it's actually helping rather than potentially causing a harm. And I don't know which it would do with PTSD, and I don't want to speculate without seeing that data.
Would you say that due to the struggle focusing during COVID, will memory and attention be impacted when things go back to normal?
So I'd say that the effect of stress on or stressors on attention are usually going to be short term. But that probably has a lot to do with whether those stressors are things that we can kind of cope with and deal with, and then come to an understanding of what happened, or if it's something that's still bothering you, right? So if it's something that's still bothering you after the fact, we know that does have some cognitive impairment associated with it. So when we think about some negative life event that happens to us, if that event remains kind of unresolved for you, then we know that that can be problematic later on. If that event is kind of resolved, it's more of a closed book, then that event is less likely to cause a problem. So in terms of what's going on right now with COVID, I think maybe the question is, what does it mean when we go back to normal? What does that normal look, at least in the short term? And if we're still stressed, if we're still worried about what could be happening, then yes, I would expect that you are going to see maybe impairments. If you're still stressed, then you would see impairments in terms of cognitive functioning. But hopefully, right, with something like mindfulness, we can help to see if we can kind of prevent those stress-related impairments.
Are there any noted differences related to gender in your research?
No, there really aren't. When I have and I always collect gender and age and ethnicity and all of those in terms of demographics for all of my studies, but we never see any differences in terms of ethnicity. We never see differences in terms of sex based on any sort of cognitive functioning. There are no differences, at least in terms of my work, in terms of the training effects that we might get. Uh, this seems to be beneficial in that it's training attention, and that happens for humans as opposed to males or females.
Is there any evidence of cognitive impairment due to stressors in crucial growth periods such as adolescence?
That's a great question from someone I know, that there are effects to early life stress. There are definitely effects to early life stress, and not necessarily just in adolescence, but earlier on. And those effects are not just cognitive effects, but they're overall in terms of psychological functioning, that we do see some effects of early life stress on later functioning. Now, in terms of how mindfulness might play a role in that, I'm not sure. I don't think we've really looked at what's going on and how maybe individuals with prior history of early life stress might be benefited as a result. But we do know that early life stress definitely has some consequences for later on overall psychological health.
Are there any literature claiming that mindfulness is a contradiction to spiritual beliefs such as Christianity?
So if you think about where mindfulness, the origin of mindfulness, right? There's a lot of origin of that really comes out of Eastern philosophy, or Eastern philosophy and religion. In terms of what we're looking at here in the lab, right? In terms of my work, in terms of the work that I cited, we're really taking a secular view on this, and so we're distilling the components that may be helpful for attention control training, that focused attention and the open monitoring, as well as loving kindness. And with loving kindness, you get maybe a little bit more into a spiritual side. So I wouldn't say that at least mindfulness meditation would be in any way contradictory to any sort of Western religion or Eastern religion for that matter. So I don't necessarily see those two as contradictory, because what we think of and the way I started this all out with thinking about mindfulness and the definition by Davidson, it really is looking at the attention training as opposed to any sort of religious philosophy.
And the last question that I got said brain frequencies and mindfulness, any relationship?
Maybe. So there is some work looking at how we respond to aversive stimuli, and we see changes in terms of different markers of attention capture and things of that nature. I'm actually it's an interesting idea looking at what might be happening just overall. Some work looking at certain frequency bands that may be increased when we meditate, and so I think that's going to be a really exciting area to explore, and one which I hopefully will be able to explore with some of my colleagues in the near future. So thank you for that question.
So thank you, Dr. Banks, and thank you, Megan, for your assistance with our questions. Thank you, Janine, as well. We've had a great audience in the up to 700 approximately, and I was certainly taking notes of how to be mindful. I find that my morning is my focus time. The earlier I can get up I can compose. It's really where I have clarity.
It's one reason why I'm one of the first people in the building usually, or at least was before we were all working from home, because I could work in the morning with less interruption.
So before we say goodbye to everyone, I just want to mention to everyone that we've got 2 of these webinars coming up next week. One that's going to be quite interesting on hypnosis and the polygraph, and also I'm going to be hosting one that is careers in psychology and counseling. So please share these opportunities with your colleagues, your friends, your family members, especially the one on careers, if you know people that are exploring different opportunities. Would you say that you had some really interesting questions today? Many of those types of topics you could explore this in depth through a study, would you say?
Absolutely. And I think I love talking with people about any of the work I'm doing, whether it's mindfulness or stress and attention control, because I always like hearing people's questions, because they may have a great idea that now I can say, okay, well, wait a minute, we really need to explore this idea. So the question about brain waves and mindfulness, I think that's a wonderful question and a definite avenue for research. I think I may have some of my students tuning in to this, so hopefully they've taken some good notes, and we can think about avenues for research studies in the fall.
And this is really just the beginning, and that's one of the things you could do with exploring academic research, scholarly research, is to gain real understanding on these subject matters.
It's one reason why I love having undergrads in my research lab, and then in our master's program where they can really come in and kind of really develop as researchers to explore a topic of their interest. I just want to say thank you, everyone, for attending, for listening, for the wonderful questions, and try to be more mindful in your daily life. And hopefully that will be helpful in terms of all the stress going on right now.
Thank you, Dr. Banks.
Thank you.